Here is a sketch of the chair, and as you can see, the legs lean at an angle of 8.5 degrees. But in addition to this angle that you can see, the legs are also leaning into the page at an angle of 8.5 degrees, hence why they are called compound angled legs. You can also see two stretchers, which have their ends angled at 8.5 degrees. And these each have mortise and tenon joints angled at 8.5 degrees. So first, we'll cut the compound angled legs and then show how to make the mortise and tenon joints, for which we'll be doing loose mortise and tenon joints because they are much easier to cut when making angled joints, and they are just as strong as traditional ones. The first step is to set the miter gauge at 8.5 degrees, and you want to be as accurate as possible here. I set the angle using a digital angle gauge that I use in conjunction with this squaring jig, which is simply a block of wood with a miter bar, which is precisely square to the table saw blade, because when it was built oversized and then cut off by the blade. This is more accurate than trying to set the blade, the angle directly against the blade. You could do that, but this is more accurate. The next step then is to set the blade angle to 8.5 degrees. You could use a digital gauge here also, but what I did was cut a scrap block of wood at the exact miter angle and then use that angled block of wood to set the blade angle. Either way can work. Next, I labeled the legs because when I cut the legs, I will first cut one end on the left side of the blade and then cut the other end on the right side of the blade. And it is critical that the same side of the leg is facing up when making these cuts. Otherwise, the two ends will have angles pointed in different directions. And here I'm cutting the legs exactly as I just described. If you've decided beforehand which of the two faces of the leg you wish to have facing outwards on the chair, then while cutting, one of those faces should be pointed up and the other should be facing the fence. And notice that on the second cut, I'm also setting the length of the leg with the stop block that's on my fence. Okay, now once you've cut all four legs, you want to go through and carefully mark what sides of the inside and where's the top and the bottom. So, because they're not, they're not symmetrical. If I put this down here, obviously it's leaning towards the inside, and these are the two inside faces here that I would mark, and then mark bottom and top. Some of what you're doing is which sides can I put on the outside though, because you can flip it, and when you flip it, the inside becomes the outside. Okay, so you can first go through and say, okay, and I meant to do this before I put the mortises in, but I didn't. Go through and pick out, okay, which sides do I want on the outside, which are usually your best looking faces, and then mark. You either mark this side for the inside or this side for the inside, and top and bottom. So again, if you flip it, you can switch the inside and the outside, but the top and the bottom obviously change, and so you need to have that marked. If you don't get them marked right, you're going to end up with a leg that doesn't work. So here is the mortising jig that I'm going to be using with my plunge router. Details on its construction can be found on page 15 of Shop Notes Magazine, issue 64. There are lots of different jig designs out there, some significantly simpler than this, but this is a nice and versatile one. And if you're interested in making one, Jerry is an expert on these and can provide details for you. And here I'm using the mortising jig, and we're going to first do the mortises in the legs. And I'm just going to slide it into the jig, which holds it pretty nicely. And the key is I'm going to line up, I've got a little center line for the center line of where my mortise goes, and I'm just going to line that up with a center line mark on the jig and then clamp it into place. The jig is automatically set to give me the correct distance from the inside of the leg. So I'm cutting in 7/8 inch from the inside of the leg The jig's automatically set up to give me that spacing. That's of course adjustable. And then you can see I've got those two stops as I slide the router back and forth. That of course gives me the length of the channel I'm digging or cutting. And then I'm just going to slide the leg down to cut the next mortise. Now notice that I need to make sure that the same side of the leg is always facing into the jig. You got to reference one side. In this case, my mortises are not centered, and so every time I put the leg in there, I need to make sure I've got the correct side facing the inside of the jig. Okay, so now I'm simply cutting the next mortise, and we continue further. Each leg actually has 4 mortises, and so now I'm rotating it around. I'm going to add 2 more to the other side. And now I'm getting ready to put the mortises in the stretchers. And I've already had the stretchers cut to size, and they have those 8.5-degree angles on the end. And the beauty of using the loose tenons is all I have to do is line up that cut end with the edge of my jig, and it will automatically give me the exact 8.5-degree angle I need. And here I'm using my big C-clamp again to clamp it into place once I've lined it up flush with my jig. And actually I decided as I was doing this that, hey, I could just add a dovetail slot. And so rather than my C-clamp, I can now also use the dovetail clamp instead. But back to reality here. Here we're clamping it up, and we're going to flip her down and do just what we did before. Now I've got the jig set up. Instead of cutting 7/8 inch from the inside, it's going to be cutting, it's roughly 3/8 or a little more than 3/8 of an inch. You could see there where the mortise line was. And same story, I'm cutting actually the same length mortise, so it's 1.5 inches again, back and forth. And that's about all it is. And now that is in there at an angle of 8.5 degrees. Okay, now here I've got everything cut up, and I'm just going to assemble things with the loose tenons I'm sticking in. I didn't show you how to make those, but it's pretty straightforward. And you can see now I got 2 loose tenons in, which are sticking out at an angle. And we stick them into the leg mortises, and that's about all there is to it. Okay, so what do you do if you make a mistake? Here I cut a mortise with the wrong face of the leg referenced in the jig, so the mortise is not placed correctly. Well, rather than throw the leg away, all I have to do is glue in a loose tenon. Once the glue is dry, I cut off the excess tenon with my Japanese flush cut pull saw I mentioned in a different video. Then I sand it flat, and I like using sandpaper glued directly to a hardwood block because that keeps the face nice and flat. If you used a random orbital sander or even a cushioned sanding block, you'd risk slightly rounding the face, which isn't good for a joint face. Here then is the final result after I cut a new mortise. The dark area is what remains of the loose tenon that I just glued in, with the rest of it being cut away to create the new mortise. So you can see the placement of the mortise shifted by about 1/8 of an inch. Here is a test assembly I did after completing the 4 top stretchers, which allowed me to double check the exact right dimensions for the lower stretchers, which I then proceeded to cut in mortise just like the top stretchers. Once this was completed, all that remained was to cut the various curves in the stretchers and the legs. This is quite straightforward, but I will show a bit on cutting the legs since the curvature on multiple faces makes them slightly trickier. Okay, and here I'm going to be marking the curves for the legs that I'm going to cut. And I'm using a little tool here I generally use for marking curves. And I've got to mark a curve on 2 faces. So the 2 outer faces are cut with curves. The 2 inner faces remain exactly flat, which is done to make the joinery much, much easier. First, we're going to cut out the curve on one side of the leg as usual on the bandsaw. Then the one trick is to tape the part we just cut off back onto the leg. This is to give us a flat face to ride along the bandsaw table as we cut the second side. And now we're cutting the second side, and you can see that bottom piece that's been taped in place. Finally, we sand down to the line on the belt sander as usual, but we again tape the cutoff back onto the leg to give us a flat face to ride on this belt sander table. And then here is the final leg.